Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to Civita Breakfast this morning in cooperation with the Oslo Freedom Forum. Let me also inform you that we live stream this event on civita.no. So a very warm welcome to all you early birds who are following us online. My name is Erik Løkke. I'm a fellow here at Civita and I will be this morning's host. Civita takes great pride in being an official partner to the OFF and thus promoting freedom and human rights worldwide. Moreover, Oslo Freedom Forum provides an excellent opportunity for us in Civita, of course, to welcome international guests and to introduce them to our audience. This morning, we have titled this breakfast meeting, Is Democracy in Decline? Between 1974 and 2005, the number of electoral and liberal democracies in the world increased dramatically. But since around 2006, freedom and democracy have stagnated, and some even say receded. Is this a permanent or a temporary trend? And moving on to political questions, should the free world be more reluctant in supporting democratic change abroad? Or must the free world continue to voice international support for democratic movements? And how can liberal democracies best promote democratic values worldwide? These are the questions we will discuss here this morning. And as always, we have an excellent panel. Larry Diamond, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and Professor of Political Science and Sociology at Stanford University. Kjell Magne Bondevik, Founder and President of the Oslo Center for Peace and Human Rights, and also a former Prime Minister in Norway. And Jonas Gahr Støre, leader of the Labour Party and former Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs. In just a few seconds, I will leave the floor to Professor Diamond. But before I end this introduction, let me provide you with some practical details. Each of the panelists will have 50 minutes for an opening speech. Thereafter, we open up for Q&As for you, the audience. If you want to come on the speakers list, I want you to give me a sign and I will put you on the speakers list. When you take the floor, I ask you to stand up, speak up, and introduce yourself, since we do not have a microphone. And I need to emphasize, as always, we're opening up for questions or short comments, not additional speeches. So I ask you to be brief upon taking the floor. As we do not have a microphone, I will repeat the question comments very shortly before I ask our excellent panel to answer. The reason being that I want to make sure that everybody can follow the dialogue. This meeting will finish no later than 9:15. Mr. Diamond needs to be at the Oslo Freedom Forum very soon after this meeting, so I have to be very strict in ending no later than 9:15. So it's extra importance that you be disciplined during the interventions and that it does not evolve into additional speeches. I would assume that we could cover around 3 or 4 questions from the audience. I kindly ask you to stay seated until 9:15, unless it's absolutely necessary to leave prior to the end of the meeting. Last point. We, of course, also urge you to use social media, and the Twitter hashtag for this meeting is Civita Focused. But do remember to turn your mobile phone on silent mode. So much for the practical details. Mr. Diamond, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ira, and thank you all for coming at this fresh hour of the morning. It's a great honor to be here at this distinguished gathering, and in particular, to appear with two of your most distinguished and important political leaders. As Ira alluded to, we are now 4 decades into what's been called the third wave of global democratization that began with the Portuguese Revolution in April of 1974. When that revolution began, only a little less than 30% of all the independent states in the world had free and fair elections to choose their leaders. And democracy really was, as I think you are well aware, a relatively rare phenomenon outside the West. In the subsequent 3 decades, that is, again, this breakpoint until about 2005 or 6, the number of democracies held steady or expanded. In fact, every year from 1975 until 2007. Nothing like this continuous growth in democracy had ever been seen before in the history of the world. Levels of freedom in the world also pretty steadily expanded during these 3 decades. And then around 2006, something happened. The expansion of freedom and democracy in the world came to a now prolonged halt. Since 2006, there's been no net expansion in the number of democracies in the world, which constitute about 55% of all the independent states over 1 million population. And since 2006, the average level of political rights and civil liberties in the world has deteriorated slightly, with the balance in each of the last 9 years being that about twice as many countries in each of these last 9 years have declined in freedom as have gained in freedom. One could see the past decade as a period of equilibrium, given that democracy expanded to a number of countries with weak facilitating conditions, such as poverty or an authoritarian neighborhood. You could say it's impressive that democracy survived or revived in so many places. But I want to articulate several other reasons for concern. First, there has been a rising tide of democratic breakdowns. In fact, the rate of democratic failure in the past decade, 14%, has been twice that of the decade 20 years before, 1984 to 1993. Democracy has been expiring, moreover, in some strategically important states, Russia and Venezuela early in this century, I would argue Turkey, Bangladesh, and Thailand very recently. Only Thailand's breakdown among these 5 came via military coup. These days, democracies are more likely to be strangled by their own elected leaders. In recent years, Turkey's Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his ruling party, the AKP, have been borrowing from Vladimir Putin's playbook, abusing state authority to undermine countervailing centers of power, punishing dissent, politicizing the judiciary, intimidating the media, and creating a quite clearly hegemonic party system. It's been so incremental that a lot of people haven't noticed that a threshold has been crossed, but I am now convinced that it has been. And so are most of the Turkish political scientists I know who are willing to render an opinion, at least in private. By now, Turkey has ceased to be even an electoral democracy. It has joined the growing ranks of competitive authoritarian regimes. Since 2005, 1 in 6 democracies has failed, many of them in this incremental fashion. The trend of erosion in freedom and the rule of law is not always evident to outside observers. We now take for granted many third-wave democracies like South Africa and Ghana, both countries that I've visited in the last few years, where principles of constitutionalism, accountability, and the rule of law have quietly been eroding. In fact, I know this is a controversial statement, but I began as an Africanist, and I'm willing to defend it in Q&A. There is not a single African country where democracy is firmly consolidated and secure today, the way it is, for example, in such third-wave democracies as South Korea and Chile. In the global democracy promotion community, few actors are paying attention to the growing signs of fragility in a number of relatively liberal developing democracies, not to mention the illiberal ones. Why have freedom and democracy been receding? The most important and pervasive answer is bad governance. If we reorganize the Freedom House data out of the 2 scales of political rights and civil liberties, into 3 scales that also include the rule of law, we find that every region performs worse on transparency and the rule of law than it does on political rights and civil liberties. The deterioration in transparency and the rule of law since 2005 has been particularly visible in many countries. And as more and more African states become resource rich with the onset of a second African oil boom, which is now well underway in Ghana, for example, the quality of governance is likely to deteriorate further. Around the world, this is the more basic point, democracies are struggling with the resurgence of what Francis Fukuyama called, building on the work of Max Weber, neo-patrimonial tendencies. Leaders who think they can get away with it are eroding democratic checks and balances, overriding term limits, violating opposition rights, and accumulating power and wealth for themselves, their families, their cronies, their clients, and their parties. Space for opposition parties, civil society, and the media is shrinking in a great many countries that are both third-wave democracies and kind of quasi-democracies or aspiring democracies. And international support for these civil society movements and organizations, most alarmingly, is drying up. Ethnic, religious, and other identity cleavages polarize many societies that lack well-designed democratic institutions to manage those cleavages, and they are manageable with the right institutions. State structures are too often unable to secure order, protect rights, and meet the most basic social needs, in part because they're so penetrated by clientelistic pressures. Democratic institutions such as parties and parliaments are often poorly developed. The bureaucracy lacks policy expertise and professionalism, and even more so the independence and authority to effectively manage the economy. Weak economic performance and, of course, rising inequality exacerbate popular disaffection. And then, of course, you know, in the area where it looked like a promising initiative to expand democracy in the world was underway, namely the Arab world, the hopes of the Arab Spring have almost completely and devastatingly imploded in every single one of the countries that rose up, except, very importantly, Tunisia. The resurgence of authoritarianism in the Arab world has been part, moreover, of a global trend. Behind its most charismatic and domineering leader since Mao Zedong, China is concentrating power, silencing dissent, violating human rights, censoring media, developing the most sophisticated control of the internet in the history of the world, and fostering fear to degrees not seen, frankly, since Mao. At the same time, China is rapidly expanding its military power and alarmingly its territorial claims, if you're following what's happening in the South China Sea. Russia as well, I don't think I need to tell you, is one of the few countries that has a border with it, is slipping deeper and deeper into naked authoritarianism, cult of personality and military adventurism, driving political opposition and civil society activists further and further into the margins of fear, inefficacy, or exile, or in the case of Boris Nemtsov, assassination. Joined together in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, these and other autocracies are honing and diffusing digital tools of internet censorship, citizen surveillance, and information control. This is part of a broader trend of renewed authoritarian skill and energy in using state-run media, both traditional and digital, to air an eclectic mix of pro-regime narratives, demonized images of dissenters, and illiberal, xenophobic diatribes. The resurgence of authoritarianism has been quickened by the diffusion of common tools, such as laws to criminalize international flows of financial and technical assistance from democracies to democratic parties, movements, independent media, election monitors, and civil society organizations in authoritarian regimes. Autocracies are also gleefully imposing broader restrictions on the ability of NGOs to form and operate, while cynically creating their own pseudo-NGOs, a favorite tactic of Mr. Putin in particular, to do their bidding in domestic and international forums. And we have to be honest in recognizing, I as an American will begin in doing so, that the threats to internet freedom, which is now as basic to democracy and human dignity as the air we breathe, do not merely emanate from the authoritarian regimes of the world. Perhaps the most worrisome dimension of the democratic recession has been the decline of democratic efficacy, energy, self-confidence, and resolve in the West, including the United States. We in the US and in large parts of Europe have some hard reform work ahead to reduce polarization, foster better policymaking, and in particular for the US, diminish the deeply corrupting influence of money in electoral politics and policy lobbying. And we must adapt and refurbish our alliances and aid strategies. I really hope we can talk about that here, for what is going to be an extended and difficult struggle, both against the resurgence of authoritarian states and the mutation and spread of Islamist terrorism. So let me conclude with these points. We need a bold strategy for renewing global democratic progress with the following elements. First, I, as a scholar of democracy, deeply believe that we must give priority in political assistance to the defense and consolidation of already existing democratic regimes. The overriding imperative must be to avoid more breakdowns of democracy, whether by executive suffocation, military coup, or state implosion, and to help consolidate promising new transitional democracies that have emerged even recently, like those in Ukraine and Tunisia. Second, we should prioritize investments to fight corruption and bad governance. This means country-level reforms to build a professional civil service, an independent judiciary, and a comprehensive array of institutions of horizontal accountability, such as counter-corruption and audit agencies that can combat bad governance. These institutions cannot exist merely on paper. They need the resources, the training, and the embedded autonomy to do their job seriously. It also requires new international efforts to identify and return stolen assets and to treat, I know this is a heavy lift, to treat predatory corruption as an international crime against humanity. Third, civil society needs more financial resources, in fact, desperately so, and tools and training in information technology to enhance their capacity to monitor government, mobilize citizens, and advocate for institutional reforms. Fourth, we need a new strategy for a new contest of ideas and information. China, Russia, Iran, and ISIS have dramatically expanded their digital capacity to disseminate propaganda and propagate half-truths. Democracies must ramp up their own means to broadcast digitally independent news and critical commentary, while also widely disseminating works of democratic theory and scholarship in a wide range of languages. In the era of massive open online courses, which are partly being innovated here at the University of Oslo, we should make learning about democracy freely available to any person, young or old, anywhere in the world, who can find a way to get online or get a thumb drive with megabytes of democratic knowledge. Since the mid-1970s, democracy has enjoyed a great and indeed unprecedented run. But democracies have been slow to grasp the gathering threats of recent years. If we do not respond with vigor, imagination, and resources, we will find ourselves living in a much grimmer and more dangerous world. Thank you.
Please, the floor is yours.
First of all, I think it's important to remember, as Larry explained to us, that it has been a substantial increase in number of more or less democratic states over the last decades, both with regard to electoral democracies and liberal democracies. And the two figures of these two types of democracies have been following each other over the last decades. Obviously, there are more electoral than liberal democracies, and I will not use time to explain the difference. I think we immediately understand the main points for that. Especially from the years 89 and 90, it was an impressive increase in number of democratic states. To a large extent, this was, of course, due to the fall of communism in Central and Eastern Europe. But in addition, we saw many new democracies in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America. That was promising. And allow me just to mention that I had the privilege of being Minister of Foreign Affairs in these years, 89 and 90, and it was unbelievable what we experienced. Reports almost every day from our embassies in Eastern and Central Europe about events, how democracy gained ground almost every day. Most of what was achieved in these years has been saved. Most of these former communist countries have developed and stabilized democracies. Why? I think one important factor was that they rather fast were integrated into European democratic organizations. The first years in OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and in the Council of Europe, not the European Council, but the Council of Europe. And we should not underestimate the importance of these two organizations, especially the first years of democratization in Eastern and Central Europe, because they made a meeting place, a framework where new and old democracies could meet and exchange views and experience. But later, of course, when they were integrated in the stronger organizations as the European Union and NATO, democratic organizations, that contributed to stabilize these democracies. I think we all hope for a new wave of democratization in the aftermath of the Arab Spring in 2010, 2011. But unfortunately, not. Only, I think, in Tunisia, they have saved most of what they achieved. In the other countries, more or less, they have fallen back to authoritarian regimes. And as Larry explained to us, after 26, there has been no net expansion in the number of democracies. A small decline in 2006, and thereafter it flattened out. But we can use this in two different ways. Either as a negative trend that democracy stopped gaining ground, or positive trend of a durability of the democratic wave. Nevertheless, the challenge is, of course, to stabilize vulnerable democracies and to expand democracy to more countries. Why promote democracy? Because some are putting that basic question. Some may say that democracy is not the most efficient way of ruling a country. For me, it's obvious that we have an obligation to promote democracy for two main reasons. One, democracy is the only consequence of being committed to human dignity, because every human being has a right to influence the society. And secondly, historically we know that democracies very seldom start war against each other. That's interesting. So democracy is in a way conflict prevention, peace work. How promote democracy? Allow me to draw a little bit upon lessons learned from the experience of the Oslo Center, because democracy assistance is our main program field. Democracy is, of course, not only free and fair elections and democratic institutions. It's first of all a question of political culture, a way of thinking. In many countries, after an election, there is usual to behave as the winners take it all, to exclude political and other minorities from positions and from influence. And this will, of course, increase tensions and conflicts. So we therefore, when we share experiences with them, emphasize that democracy is to develop inclusive societies and power sharing. And in this regard, we can say in the Norwegian framework as well, coalition governments is a good exercise. Because in a coalition government, you cannot take into account only one party or group's interests, but several. Coalition building must be learned. So what we are doing from the Oslo Center is to share our experiences, how to run coalition governments, how to build alliances in parliaments, and between different political parties. Another challenge is that in many countries, the political leadership live more or less in isolation from their people, from common people. So it's so important to build up meeting places between political leaders and the civil society, to stimulate for dialogue instead of confrontation. Another challenge is that there is a tendency that democratically elected leaders do not step down when their term expires. We know from African countries that several of them have initiated changes of the constitution in order to continue in their office after their time. And even in European countries now, some are sitting too long in office. And maybe they start thinking that they are the only who can rule this country. And they become more and more authoritarian. Maybe that's a part of the problem in countries which was mentioned here, like Russia, Turkey, and we can also add Hungary. I know all the three leaders of these countries, and I must admit that I am surprised how they have developed and how they behave today compared to 10 years ago. Another important challenge in democracy assistance is to increase the knowledge and the commitment to universal fundamental human rights and international law. I cannot use more time on that now. Of course, in the world of today, there is also a threat to democracy that we have these extreme political and religious groups willing to use violence. And therefore, it is so important to make frameworks for interreligious dialogue in order to build down images of enemies and stereotypes. Let me end up by mentioning another important challenge if you should promote further democratization. And that is, as also Larry touched upon, the resurgence of authoritarianism in a country like Russia, great power, and still it is the case in China. And in my view, it is really a threat to democracy if these power states increase their influence, as we see China especially is doing now in Africa. What will that mean for democracy in the future on the African continent? And what will their Russian behavior mean for the future of democracy, especially in the eastern part of Europe? I just raised the question. So to conclude this short introduction, over the last decades, democracy has gained ground. Don't forget that. But true. Over the last 10 years, there has been no net expansion of democracy. There have been some steps forward also the last years, but some breakdowns. For the future, I do believe, I'm almost always an optimist. I do believe that democracy will gain more ground because more people will experience that democracy in the longer perspective is to their benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, Kjell Magne Bondevik. Jonas Gahr Støre, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you to Civita for again raising important issues, and Professor Diamond, thank you for sharing your research. And I'd like to salute all those who do research on democracy and try to provide also facts and figures on an issue which also has to be a strongly emotional one. I think I'll use my 10 minutes to reflect on what I see as a few dilemmas. And in my view, one quality of democracy is the ability to live with dilemmas and to live with issues that are not black and white, to live in a society where you have inclusive dialogue so you can reach this very important notion of balanced societies, namely compromise. And I think Kjell Magne Bondevik is using this point many times when we meet and discuss democracy, the very appalling principle of the winner takes it all in some notions of democracy, which is a very dangerous thing, and especially because those winners who take it all, they take things away from the other side and create seeds for conflicts, which then again may be eroding democracy. It is a simple principle, but a very complex practice. I think that is what we experienced since 1976 with the progress and then the decline, if that intervened in 2006, maybe. I think that is the lesson we learn, how complex the practice is, how important it is that it is rooted very deeply in culture and social mechanisms of that society, be it at the local level, be it at the national level, and I think in Europe we should also question, is it at the continental level? So to me, in addition to talking about government by the people, of the people, for the people, and elections, which we all agree is a key criterion, we should focus on some of these qualities of a complex practice. Kjell, you mentioned 89-90, and I served that government that you were with the foreign minister at the time. And I remember a visit to East Berlin and Prague in January 1990. In Prague, Václav Havel was sitting in the chateau. He just had moved in, and he was in his jeans and pullover with holes on his shoulders, and he was saying, I'm gonna make a system out of this mess. So there were democratic traditions in that Czechoslovakia that he could grab onto when he installed democracy after all those long years of communist rules. In East Berlin, the communists were on their way out. And I remember the state secretary in the foreign ministry said that this is going to an end. The empire is down. And Gott sei Dank haben wir kein mehr Guillotine. So he was happy that his head would still be on top of his body after that change. So there were seeds for this. I think one important thing in democratic research which we have to worry about and care about and interest our focus is about the quality of the civil society. Its pluralism, its mechanism, because democracy for individuals is more than putting the ballot. It's also about having a daily experience of being able to influence what is around you. At the workplace, in your local community, who's going to build a road across your property, and all these dimensions which gives the culture of being co-responsible, which I think is absolutely key. And that's why democracy which is being imposed by a coup, and democracy which is being installed from outside without having these cultural sensitivities, understanding them is almost doomed to fail. And remember about our democracy, which we are proud about for good reason, if we really study, then as we did, Mr. President of Parliament, last year, 200 years after the Constitution, all those decades of civil society and popular movement that led to the formation of our political parties. Very important to understand the functioning of our democracy today. Now, the second part is a bit follow-up of what Kjell Magne Bondevik said. This should be an idea which time has come, in the sense that we live in a global market economy, where we know that people's ability to thrive, have influence, use their knowledge, creativity, is the key criterion for success in taking advantage of new technology, develop new technology, organize around new technology. All that leads people to say, I want influence, I want to be heard, I want to be seen, which are key criterion for democracy. Now, China may be the example to say that that is not happening. But I remain an optimist. I think eventually it's going to push in that direction, because people will eventually ask their say. And it really struck me when I visited China as a foreign minister, until China did not want visits from foreign ministers for this very dangerous, big, small country, Norway. It struck me when I met lawyers. They told me that until 1980, there were no private lawyers in China, because there was a political legal system. All conflicts were solved by political decisions. But after the market economy was let loose, they needed a legal system and they needed lawyers to do that arbitrage of conflict of interest. And eventually that should lead to people, all these operators, having influence over their decisions, having the creative process, which should lead to democracy. Let's hope that is maybe happening. Third observation, I think authoritarian rule is extremely attractive, seen from a democratic standpoint, because you see everything they can do without any hindrances. They can just decide. They don't need to spend time in parliament, they don't need to consult people, they can just move on. And when you dig deeper, you find out that is not the case. They are very vulnerable. And because they have no antennas in this civil society, they have fear pictures which don't always resonate with truth. And we see that the most authoritarian countries are also sometimes the most inefficient in decision-making. It struck me when dealing with the Middle East, Saudi Arabia is a very authoritarian country, but with a very complex decision-making. They have 2,000 princes to consult. We have only a few parliamentarians across the street. I think it's much easier. So there are some reasons for concern for Denmark for me. And one key is, of course, legitimacy. And I believe and I would be interested to hear Professor Diamond, is modern democracy dependent on progress and advancement? Can democracy cope over time with decline? Because legitimacy is, of course, key to democracy. The legitimacy of leaders. We who are elected, we have to be held to account. Do we deliver? We promise things, we have ambitions, we set out to deal with challenges in society. Can we deliver? And the problem nowadays is that people say, we are in doubt. Because employment is chronically high. You don't settle the environmental, climate issues. Cities are growing, urbanization is taking place at a pace which is not creating better life in cities, and so on. And we see the fragmentation of the political system, where the state-bearing parties are losing ground, and you have populist grounds growing from both sides. So this is a question, I think, a true dilemma. Modern democracy is vulnerable when there is not progress, growth, jobs, solving of key issues. And in Europe, I believe we have a double challenge. On the one hand, chronic unemployment, youth unemployment, and social tensions which are not being dealt with on the one hand, and the EU, which really merited its peace prize for securing democracy at that critical stage, is in itself struggling with its legitimacy. 10 years ago, countries in Europe were looking for the EU as where they wanted to go. This is no longer the case in many of the new member states. They do not necessarily want to go in the same road, which gives, again, breathing ground for authoritarian rules. The US, beacon of democracy, has institutions which no longer function. Let's be blunt about it. I mean, that system, Professor Diamond, you can elude us, but I mean, the system was based on the fact that the liberal part of the Republican Party and the right part of the Democratic Party overlapped and could settle issues when it came to real reforms. And now they operate more like a parliamentarian European system where they are separated. and they're not able to solve and deal with real issues. Final remark, the cultural seeds of democracy. The attraction is that I want the system because I have a say, so I have an influence. This is being challenged, I think, by a phenomenon we need really to understand, which is the role of identity in the 21st century. Is this the issue which is most attractive? Now we have, surprise, religion becoming a key identity issue, breeding military movement, strife, and conflict. It should be the other way around. Most religions have another objective. And we have culture, and we have all dividing lines which are not leading to the breeding ground of democracy. And the final remark is, of course, on the opportunity, if there is one, to assist in building democracy from the outside. How successful is it? Now, in the last decade, it has been done by military might. Didn't go well. I must say, personally, as a foreign minister, I've been pushing in countries for them to hold elections, because it's a sign of democracy. And we need to ask, is pushing for election really helping democracy? In some instances, pushing for elections at the wrong moment create divisions and tension and conflict. I mean, we pushed very hard for elections in Afghanistan, and once they had the result, we said, well, you know, that result, we have to negotiate to find the right way to deal with it. And then I would just like to say that I think there's one element that Professor Diamond mentioned. I think it is important for the breeding ground or the cultural seeds of democracy, which is the danger of polarization, which is limiting our ability to find the compromises day to day in democracy, solving the small issues. And there we are on to issues of inequity, of people who can look each other in the eye, comparing, you know, life conditions, not having these huge differences, which creates different classes of belonging. So I remain an optimist, but I think there are key challenges to democracy which keep some very unpleasant questions all too open. Thank you.
Thank you to all panelists for very interesting introductions. I will very short open up for Q&As from the audience. I already noticed 3 people wanting to come on very quickly, and a fourth, and fifth. I will try to get everybody of you, but as I mentioned, I will have to end within 9:15. So I think I would start with Halvorsen. Was the first one, and remember to speak up and be brief. Please stand up.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm independent service. No one of you mentioned the word nationhood. Of course, China is a nation and China is not a democracy. But what we see in Iraq today, I think is a very interesting example that you cannot build a democracy without having a feeling of being together, belonging to a nation. And the problem with Iraq was not that the West tried to introduce democracy. The problem was that they didn't have a feeling of belonging together in a nation. And we see that today. So isn't nation building just as important as democracy building?
Okay, the question is about nation building. If I start with you, Barry Dunn, what role does nation building play in the role of democracy?
Well, first thing I want to say is I was opposed to the intervention in Iraq, and even though I went there afterwards to try and help write the interim constitution and foster democratic development, I think that it was one of the most disastrous things the American government has done in the post-World War II period. And I agree with the comment you made that we can't promote democracy ever at the point of a bayonet or a tank, or A, it won't work, and B, it will discredit the process of democracy promotion, which is part of the trouble that we're in. And if many of you are wondering why this inflection point in terms of the stagnation or decline of democracy happened around 2005, you might bear in mind what happened in March of 2003 in terms of the American invasion of Iraq. I agree with your point. It's the fundamental point of Dankwart Roustow's seminal essay, Transitions to Democracy, that the one actual precondition for successful democratization is some sense of what constitutes the nation, some agreement on that. But if you look at the work of Juan Lintz and Alfred Stapon on the formation of what they call state nations, like India, which have a kind of multinational sense of statehood, I think you can start with a partial sense of this, and then gradually, as the Indians have done, build up a more robust sense of what constitutes the nation state. What you can't start with is no sense of this and complete fragmentation and expect to build democracy on that. And you see the disintegrating impact of it in Iraq today. It's really a tragedy.
Kjell Magne Bondevik.
Yeah, I do agree on that, and I can say much about the invasion of Iraq. It was a great mistake by US and UK, and we remember it. We stood up against that invasion, and I think we have experienced today some of the consequences of that invasion. But I also will mention another dimension of building a nation, a nationhood, and that is ethnicity. Because from countries where the Oslo Center have projects today, I think in Kenya, South Sudan, Somalia, ethnic conflicts are crucial and a special challenge which we are not used to from our democracy in Norway. So the best challenge is how to build commonalities between the ethnic clans in such countries like that, how to build a nation. And of course, the answer is to bring them together, to find commonalities and so on, but very often also the political solution has to be a sort of federalism, because they demand some self-determination in areas where they have the majority and where they in fact are ruling. So federalism is the key word, very often the only solution for running such a state. You have the same in Myanmar now, Burma, where the ethnic, you cannot understand Myanmar if you don't understand the ethnic dimension in that country. So that is a very important challenge in many countries with regard to nationhood.
Gahr Støre, you mentioned identity and nation building with many different identities. That could be a problem, couldn't it?
Clearly, I think Kjell's question is very key. I mean, modern democracy is very much linked, of course, to a nation, a political entity, and the state system. But I think what is still very interesting when you visit beyond Europe, which we know culturally, you find that in the civil society fabric, which I believe is very important to focus on, as I mentioned in my intervention, you find very strong democratic tradition and instincts, which are not necessarily what we recognize in our modern European state-building mechanisms of having elections every fourth year, or electing our candidates at schools and at the workplace and so on. But it's a question about, is there a culture in the civil society that you come to, that you solve issues by negotiation, by dialogue, by compromise, accepting the final decision. Now, still 200-300 years after the creation of the modern European nation state, we hold on to that notion as the key of organizing political systems. And that is a bit absurd, because we have to compare Norway with China or Luxembourg with China. So I think we have to go a bit deeper than that, and that our European lens of understanding and analyzing democratic functioning has some limitations, because there are very weak comparisons in the way states are run, nations are run.
I already have too many signed-on speakers that I will try to get to as many as possible. First, Kjell, I noticed.
Thank you. My name is Kjell Magne. I'm a political scientist at Civita and president of the European movement. We had a very interesting seminar yesterday with the former Minister of Defense, Volker Riehe from Germany, and Janusz Oniewski from Poland. And Oniewski said that the main reason for the problems of Turkey and Russia is that the political system, political culture is not based on rationality and reason, but on faith. What do you think about that? On faith, the believing in some kind of as he said about Russia, some kind of true Christianity. And Putin is the the Messiah of this true Christianity. And Jonas said that there were more checks and balances in the Soviet system than there is today in Russia.
So, of course, Russia is a challenge, and the question is about Putin and the role of faith. Well, I'll start with you, Bonnie.
As a believer, I'm in doubt. Not only since I'm a believer, but well, to be serious, it is of course very important to differ between religion and politics. But I can see that as a main problem in Russia and Turkey of today. Of course, it's interesting because I talked several times with now former Prime Minister Erdogan in Turkey. He was very interested in the relations between religion and politics. And he was interested in my approach as a Christian Democrat. And he had the vision of developing his party to be a Muslim democratic country. Not to mix faith and politics, but to see the ethical links between them. And they are obvious. So I'm surprised how he has developed and how he's behaving today. But I don't think his main problem is that faith is taking over for politics in his situation. I think it's simply a question of power. He likes power. And he has been used to power too long time. And I do believe the same with Putin in Russia. Well, sometimes we say that Putin has two main pillars for his policy. That's Orthodox Church and it's petroleum. What is most important, I don't know. But maybe that are the two main pillars. But I don't think the faith has taken over for Putin in a wrong way. I think it's more a question of keeping power.
Jonas Gahr Støre.
Well, I think this alludes to the point I tried to make in my intervention that, when you are not delivering on the real issues of people, when you are set to govern, in semi-authoritarian regimes, you pull out other identities and threat factors to stick on to power. And to me, that is the analysis of Russia. They are failing their modernization. I mean, at least under Medvedev, there was a modernistic agenda. They wanted to attract research and investment. And when he was here on a state visit in 2010, the discussions he had intensively with us was how we organize our research council, how can we get modern people to come in. Now, when Putin came back to power, I think he found out, this is for some reason not working, and he has to turn to this kind of pseudo identity issues, which is creating threat. And I mentioned this at other discussions. I don't see him necessarily as being an aggressive expansionist, but an aggressive isolationist, which is, struggling to hold together his own. And there are long stories about how the Tsars have done that to keep power in Russia. They fear more things coming from underneath in their own society than really the threat from outside.
Professor Diamond, you mentioned Turkey in your speech, and it was kind of depressing to seeing it has developed in the wrong direction. And I mean, Turkey has also been said that it should be a model for the rest of the Middle East in terms of democracy. It can have really devastating consequences for democratic promotion if Turkey goes the direction you says. Couldn't it?
It could, but I think the model in Turkey has mutated in a way that Prime Minister Bondevik perfectly captured in his remarks. And I think that when Abdullah Gül was a moderating factor in the AKP, things were better, just as when Medvedev was president during that brief 4-year period, things were better. I strongly associate with everything that these two distinguished gentlemen have just said, but just with one caveat that I'll add in a minute. And I think the implications of this are, first of all, to remind ourselves, because you see this always with the cynical mobilization of ethnicity in sub-Saharan Africa as well, that the mobilization of identity, nationalism, religion, ethnic, communal identity, it's the last refuge of scoundrels who don't have programs and good governance to offer their people in the competition for power. That's the first point. And the second point is, this is why we need term limits. Somebody may start out as a relatively decent figure, and they go bad as they get drunk with power and insecure in the face of it. The Putin of today is not the Putin who assumed power in 1999-2000. And Erdogan, I think, has mutated in really worrisome ways. Now, was he always like that and just waiting for this opportunity? There's no way to know. But one of the things that we really need to fight is the expanding effort of elected leaders to eliminate term limits so they can stay there forever. The one caveat I would add, with a slight tweak of what you just said, is I think it's not aggressive expansionism that is at work in Russia today, but opportunistic expansionism. I don't think Vladimir Putin has a strategy to swallow up Ukraine that he was waiting to unfold until the right moment, or any place else. But he will respond to opportunities and he will exploit weakness, which is why I think refurbishing NATO is frankly an urgent priority right now. And standing up to his opportunism, I think, is an urgent priority right now. And the other tweak is that because his system has failed so badly, and because there's a limit to how far he can ride the Russian Orthodox religion itself to the perpetuation and consolidation of his power, he needs the stoking of the fires of aggrieved Russian nationalism to continue to support his political base. And unfortunately, I think this is going to require continued military adventurism in order to do that. And that's a very sobering implication I take out of his invasion of Ukraine.
There was many hands in the beginning. There was somebody in there, I think. Yes, you. Please stand up, speak up.
As an American, I look at the EU as an experiment in democratization of Europe. And if this was 100 years ago, we might have a war over it at this point. So that's an interesting. So my question is, going forward with and looking at, as an example of the Middle East, for example, and saying Iraq 10 years ago, the invasion was a mistake. Now we're at least seeing the results or an ongoing policy of an opposite sort of point of view of letting the events sort of sweep the Middle East, which may take a generation or two to see the results of that. So given that the 10 years ago, the invasion didn't work, there seems to be a lot of conflict that what's going on now isn't the right course of action as well. What does the democracies of the world do in this instance and going forward from a global perspective in dealing with these issues to help democracies sort of take hold in areas, specifically the Middle East, when you have a situation that's ongoing now.
So the question is about the Middle East. That could, of course, be another breakfast meeting and a long discussion. But it is an interesting part that most people agree that the Iraqi invasion was a failed mission. But now nobody's doing anything in Syria. And that is also some round of criticism. So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. What are your thoughts, Bondevik? Is Syria an example to follow for the world community?
Well, there are many failed nations, and I don't think that we can start and argue for invasion in countries that are failing. First of all, it's important, and especially for a small country like Norway, that we are behaving in full accordance with international law and order. And of course, that was a problem with regard to Iraq. In my view, it was in contradiction to international law, what they did. They had no mandate from the UN. They were not asked upon by the Iraqi authorities to come, as they were now, with regard to IS. That's very different, because then it is in full accordance with international law. So to keep up international law and order is in itself very important in order to promote democracy. Secondly, I will say that I think in the longer perspective, regime change is not sufficient argument to invade a country. There are many regimes we should want to change. But that's not an argument in itself to invade.
But is there an argument to do something in Syria, to do something more militarily maybe? Or?
If we could, of course, I know that it's a problem, especially because of Russia and China, to get a consensus in the UN. With regard to fight IS in Iraq, the international community has been asked by Iraq to act, and we do. With regard to Syria, we don't have the same request from the Syrian authorities, and that is, of course, a challenge. It's a dilemma, of course, but I'm not sure that an invasion in contradiction to international law in Syria will help the situation. Because who are we going to fight for? We know that the opposition in Syria is so fragmented, and there are different groups who will take over in Syria. You don't know. So the situation is so complex that I don't think that is a solution. To be honest, I don't see for the time being a clear solution on the Syrian problem. But I don't see an invasion as a solution either.
Kjell Støre, any thoughts of the Middle East democracy?
Well, big complex. I think one thing we do learn is if we study the forces that are exposed in these conflicts, we see deep roots. So, you may be tempted to say, well, this is something which has a big anchor, Shia, Sunni, Arab, Kurd, and does it need to have to be fought out in some sense? I think that our participation in the current training mission in Iraq is in itself highly complex, because it is not, as it was mentioned, Iraq is not one nation asking for help. There are 4 military forces fighting each other on that terrain, and we are now seeming to end up supporting 2 of them in some kind of contradiction. So I think clearly invasion is no answer. Who should invade? And I would certainly not be pressing the button for yes, sending troops to invade with.
But on that notion, what about Libya? I mean, Norway was part of getting rid of Gaddafi. It wasn't turned out to be a
good question. I would say, here you have a generation of decision makers in Europe who have been deeply marked by 2 recent events in Europe: Srebrenica, and in Africa, the massacre in Rwanda. And here was another probable scenario of another slaughter of civilians. And you have an international mandate to intervene by all necessary means. Okay, one could say this is a bluff. We don't. And I, for one, was clearly, critical to what military might from above could do to really settle issues on the ground. And it ended as it did, and I think it's clear that from the international community, there was a complete abandon of responsibility after that intervention. What that could have been instead is difficult to say, because it is very complex. But I think it simply proves that, fixing very deeply rooted issues on the ground from high altitude is a tricky issue.
Larry Diamond, what would you say are the learnings from the past 10 years in the Arab world?
I want to address 2 points.
Sure.
One, the point that was just made about Libya, and then come back to the question about what positively we can do in terms of democracy promotion in the Middle East. So I was strongly against the American military intervention in Iraq. I don't disagree with anything that either of you said. I really felt Libya was different. The people had risen up. There was a revolution underway, and there was absolutely no doubt, let's not rewrite history, that they were going to be brutally slaughtered in Benghazi unless we acted. And let me tell you, the President of the United States waited till the last possible moment to launch NATO airstrikes. If he had waited 24 more hours, it might have been too late. The intervention was successful. The combination of air power and the revolutionary military action of Libyans risking their lives, many of them with no military background, doctors, lawyers, engineers going back to the country to fight in a very idealistic way for their country, toppled one of the most ruthless dictators and one of the most unpredictable ones in the Middle East. And then, you are absolutely right, we walked away. We just walked away from Libya. There was a specific request from the Libyan transitional government to the President of the United States asking for military and security assistance. And from what I know, they got virtually nothing. And I think that is a very short-sighted and disgraceful lapse in our judgment and historical responsibility. Now, to the question that was posed, look, the challenge now is not mainly a military challenge. It is in Iraq. It is in a limited way with respect to ISIS. But in most of the Middle East, you don't have warfare. What you have is resurgent authoritarianism. And I think the imperatives are to return to the bread and butter of diplomacy and political assistance to defend and advance democratic constitutionalism, as you said, civil society, and human rights. And every country needs a different strategy. In Tunisia, they need enormous amounts of transitional economic assistance, state assistance to reform their state institutions, and build up the judiciary, the party system, and so on and so forth, and strengthen civil society. In Egypt, we need enormous collective pressure on a semi-fascistic government that is about to put to death over 100 innocent people, and they've already executed many of them on totally spurious charges, thinking, well, we'll just go along because we need them in the war on terror. And so we need to kind of buck up our resolve here and make it clear to the military government, let's not forget what it really is in Cairo, that there will be it's not going to be business as usual and he can kill 100 more people and then we'll just ignore what he's done. There are going to be lasting consequences to his position in the world if he goes ahead with this, and that someday he may be dragged before The Hague and held accountable for what he's done.
30 seconds, Costa.
Yes, on that last example, 3 years ago when Egypt was in this balance, we very modestly organized a trip from Cairo to Oslo with a group of Egyptian politicians and political activists, ranging from the Muslim Brotherhood through traditional secular parties, a group of 10, 15 people. They spent a week in Oslo and they visited institutions, parliament, government, the press, the ombudsman's office, and so on. And they all ended up in my office as foreign minister. And they said, they had learned more about each other on that trip than they ever had back in Cairo. And they found out that, we may differ, but we don't kill each other at first sight. Now the guy from the Muslim Brotherhood has a death sentence. He is in prison. And one of the charges brought against him is his visit to Oslo on that trip. Which I think, is just absolutely appalling. And it makes me really sick to think about that he is sitting there, perhaps waiting for that peloton with these charges hanging on his head.
We will take 2 more interventions from the audience. First, Stig Arnel, and then also notice the lady. And then we will end. Stig Arnel first.
Professor Diamond, you mentioned corruption, which I'm very happy you mentioned. It's important in the climate of democracy. I have another question about economics. Støre, you mentioned progress, and I understand that as meaning not exclusively possibly, but economic growth, first and foremost. And GDP is the number that's being held up most when we try to ask the question whether a country or a government is successful. Do they provide growth, economic growth for its people? To what extent do you think that our obsession with this absolutely absurd number, which says very little about human progress, about human development, creates problems for the expansion of democracy?
So the question about the role of GDP in the democracy discussion, I start with you, Larry Diamond. What role do you see when we use GDP? Is it a good measure to measure economic growth and the quality of democracy?
It's obviously a very troubled measure, and you know that or you wouldn't have asked the question. And it's troubling in part because, in some places it's not that, in lower income countries, not that easy to measure it, and there's a lot of measurement error, but also it tells us nothing about the distribution of wealth. Look at the, per capita income of Equatorial Guinea, which looks like a, middle income or higher country, and look at how the people of that miserable slice of earth are living, and you realize that, most of the oil wealth is being absconded with, so it can become ridiculous. I mean, this is why we have the Human Development Index, because it's a much better measure of real experienced and lived development progress. And so I usually kind of favor that in trying to understand what kind of human development progress is being made.
One minute.
Yeah,
This is a very interesting question, and it's an increasing international debate how we should measure the welfare state. And last week, or 2 weeks ago, on the Partnership for Change conference here in Oslo, it was a speech by Professor Michael Green, who has developed what he calls a social index. Not to replace GDP, because GDP has its value, but it's limited. It's saying something, but not everything about the welfare state. So to try to develop a social index in addition to GDP to supplement each other, we say more about the quality of a society. That goes on, that has to do with, of course, criteria as health and education, democracy, respect for human rights, and other important issues that has to do with our welfare. So, and I know that there will be a debate in the Norwegian Parliament about this as well, because there is a proposal coming up from some parties that will initiate a debate about this. It's really timely to have this debate.
Just very shortly, on purpose, I did not mention GDP. I talked about progress, and of course, being able to continue distributive policies, balancing a well-functioning society is different if you are in progress or in decline. Now, I believe democracy is very good when you meet tough times, and you have, I mean, we basically in this country have been discussing how to distribute growth. How do you handle distribution of decline? And there, you would say ideally democracy would be the best because you could balance again and distribute the burdens and get acceptance for how you deal with those tough times. Now, fortunately, we have not had to experience that much, but it will be interesting to see the quality of democracy throughout Europe as they have to face 50% youth unemployment and other mass reductions of characteristics of their welfare states. Will they be the same democracies on the other side? I question that.
Last question from the audience. Please just come up and speak up.
I'm Sylvia from Leadership Foundation. What I'd like to ask is, how do you preach democracy to a country like Uganda, which has had Yoweri Museveni for like almost quarter century, and is going to rule for another 5 years? And that's the example of democracy. And before that was Idi Amin, so that's the only thing that they know. So how do you preach democracy to such a country in Africa?
So the question is, how do you preach democracy to Uganda? I think we can take that question and also take your final remarks. I can start with you, Bondevik. Any good advice to Uganda?
Well, I'm not an expert on Uganda. We are not working in that kind of African country, but we see the same in Uganda as in several other African countries, that some leaders believe that they are the only who can rule that country. And they stay in office and change the constitution in order to continue. So it is a question about a democratic culture. I want once again to emphasize that. It's not only about democratic institutions and legislation and so on. It's a question about power sharing. Power sharing is a key word for democracy. So that culture has to develop in Uganda as well. Egypt is a very interesting case. I had a delegation from the Muslim Brotherhood in my office yesterday, and some of them have been in prison for several years. It was a very interesting case because, as we know, President Morsi from Muslim Brotherhood, he was democratically elected in Egypt, no doubt. But so he started to behave and develop the country in a way that many were really feared that he would develop an Islamic state, an undemocratic state. And so the real Democrats of Egypt made an alliance with the military and they made a coup against the democratically elected government. What should we say about that? I don't have a clear answer. It's up to the Egyptians. But how they are now behaving with all these death penalties, imprisoning of political opponents, I don't think there is a solution of the threat of an Islamic state to imprison people like members of Muslim Brotherhood. So once again, this has to do with developing a democratic way of thinking, a democratic culture. You don't make a sustainable democracy by force and by imprisoning your opponents. That should be my last word.
Just a final remark.
Well, on Uganda, my last encounter with the president in Uganda was a 1-hour discussion about the death penalty for homosexuals. And that was a bill proposed in Parliament, and it would be adopted perfectly democratically by elected representatives. So it would be a legitimate decision. Now, at the same time, I would say, having met with, people from your country, I presume, there is a deep democratic culture in part of the cultural civil society of your country. So I think one element that Professor Diamond turned to, which is very complex but still possible, is to continue to support in the right way the channels of communication and openness to these undercurrents. And one day that may be what builds momentum for democratic change.
Larry Diamond, your final remark?
First of all, let me pick up on where you left off with respect to Uganda specifically and its political culture. If you look at the data, as I do very closely and repeatedly, of the Afrobarometer, the repeated public opinion survey, which I think possibly Norwegian Aid is supported, and if it has, I thank you for doing so, because it's an extremely important instrument for understanding democratic development in Africa. You see a general, and frankly to me as a social scientist and trained as a modernization theorist, I think that there's a strong relationship between economic development, prosperity, and education on the one hand, and the growth of democratic values on the other. So if you start with that theoretical presumption, the results in one respect are shocking. Not that they contradict that people will gravitate more to democratic values as they become more educated and embedded in a market economy and so on. Although very few people are taking note of it, I think that's happening in China. But that doesn't mean that poor people with very limited education, who might even still be illiterate, can't, by means of experience and by means of other forms of social communication and civic experience in a kind of Tocquevillian fashion, come to a deep and sincere conviction about the value of democracy, rule of law, and human rights. And the Afrobarometer data show, in general, in sub-Saharan Africa, and specifically in Uganda, that this has happened, that there's a strong aspiration for political accountability, for limited government, for a rule of law, for a legislature that can constrain the executive, for independent judiciary, not just a kind of infatuation with the word democracy and nobody understanding what it means. And I think Uganda is an excellent country with which to conclude and discuss this problem for two reasons. Number one, the problem is not the people of Africa. It really isn't. And it isn't the culture, and it isn't even the, quote, primordial, end quote, I hate when that word is used, ethnic divisions, which we know are manipulated for cynical political advantage in the way we were discussing earlier. The problem is the elites who barricade themselves in power, gorge themselves on the wealth of the country, and don't want to leave. And you got the typical African party problem now with Museveni, who's been there for over 3 decades and is now grooming his son to succeed him. And it is, it's shameful. It's shameful that it's been allowed to happen. And it's shameful that Western aid agencies keep pouring money into the general accounts of the state budget with no accountability or demand for really free and fair elections, which are grotesquely rigged in Uganda. And the country will not move forward, and I think the Ugandan people know it, without democracy. My second point, I've got 2 more points. One is Museveni knows what he's doing. You think he cares about whether people are gay or not and who they sleep with and who they love? He's latched onto this for the same reason that Putin has latched onto ethnocentric Russian identity and now his infatuation with the most conservative and atavistic elements of the Russian Orthodox Church. It serves his purposes politically to create some outgroup that can focus the wrath, the frustration, the angst of a population that's unhappy. And whenever you're in trouble politically, the last refuge of a political scoundrel is to pick on some marginal minority and try and steer all of the public's anger and frustration toward them. Finally, I do want to say, in response to Prime Minister Bondevik, that it is true, I think it's unambiguously true, that Morsi was abusing power, number one, and moving very rapidly toward the construction of an authoritarian, at least Islamist influenced state, in which the Muslim Brotherhood was going to become a hegemonic power. I personally think that that was rapidly happening. It was partly a response to what he saw as the insecurity of this situation, and partly a response to the fact that I think he isn't and wasn't a Democrat. And that stands in stark contrast to the Islamist political leader of Ennahda in Tunisia, Rashid Ghannouchi, who made a series of just dramatically different political choices that helped to understand why Tunisia moved in a very different direction. But the 2 points I wanted to make is none of that justifies a death sentence against Morsi or any other of these individuals, number one. And number two, none of that justifies a conclusion that the secular Egyptian kind of political activists and party leaders who then came out onto the streets, called for the military to intervene, and blessed the military coup of July 2013, that they themselves were Democrats. They were liberals, but they're not Democrats. And that frankly, there are precious few Democrats in Egypt because the liberal, middle-class, secular people, many of them my friends, are fearful of the populist majority, as intolerant of the Muslim Brotherhood as the Muslim Brotherhood was of them, and all too willing to bless and ignore the authoritarian excesses of the current government. There are a few dedicated liberals who are deeply committed to democracy, who are in civil society and academia and so on, and it's very important to understand that many of them are in jail now as well, or banned from leaving the country, like my friend who's supposed to be a visiting scholar at Stanford right now, Professor Amr Hamzawi of the American University of Cairo. And they're in very, very grave danger now. And these are not Islamists. They are liberal. They're people who identify with our values in almost every respect.
Before we give a warm round of applause, let me use 20 seconds to say 3 things. My apology to the people who didn't come on to the speakers list due to time. Our next breakfast meeting should be interesting for many here. It's about Putin's Russia and how Europe should meet that challenge with Minister of Defense Ina and European politicians. And do follow the Oslo Freedom Forum on oslofreedomforum.com. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the panelists.